On the night of the ceremony, when the hall was already swelling with chatter and laughter, his own niece looked straight through him and whispered to another relative, "Why is he even here? Nobody remembers him anymore." The words, though not meant for his ears, struck harder than a blow. He stood among them, surrounded by faces that had once leaned on his strength, guided by his lessons, lifted by his sacrifices, and yet now he was a ghost. Eyes slid past him as if he were transparent, as if the years he had poured into their lives had been erased by the brightness of newer names and fresher pride. He lingered near the back, a single figure in the press of bodies, invisible in the very crowd that would not exist without him. No smile greeted him, no hand reached out. Conversations sparked and flared all around, yet not a single word was directed toward him. Laughter rang in the air, the clinking of glasses echoed under the chandeliers, but none of it touched him. It was as though his presence was an intrusion, an unwelcome shadow in a room that had chosen to forget the roots of its own glory. And as he stood there, the sting of their dismissal only deepened when he looked upon the familiar faces, sons, daughters, nephews, colleagues, those who had once hung on his every word. He remembered them younger, fragile, and uncertain, when he had been the one to steady them with advice, to shield them with labor, to carry burdens they could not lift. Now those same faces turned toward others with admiration, as though their foundation had been laid by different hands. The cruelest part was not the laughter, not the whispers, not even the cold glances. It was the absence, the absolute void of acknowledgement. To be erased while still alive. To be treated not as a man who had built, who had sacrificed, who had given, but as if he were nothing more than a stranger, intruding where he did not belong. Every passing second pressed down on him, stripping away not his dignity, but their own. He did not speak. He did not call their names, did not remind them who he was. His silence was not weakness, but endurance. The same endurance that had carried him through storms and left him standing when others fell. If they chose not to recognize him, then so be it. But deep inside, he felt a calm certainty. Truth has a way of rising. Legacy does not vanish simply because pride blinds itself to it. Tonight, they might treat him as forgotten, as a face lost in the crowd. But he knew the moment was coming when that illusion would collapse, when the truth would break through the arrogance that tried to bury it. And so he stood still, his presence quiet yet unyielding, like a stone in the river of voices rushing past him. They did not see him, they did not greet him, but they would, when his name was spoken aloud, not as an afterthought, but as the very first on the list that no one could deny. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has anything like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you truly help us grow this channel. And now, we continue. They moved around him like water flowing around a stone, never touching, never slowing. Relatives brushed past with forced smiles for others. Cousins clasped hands with distant acquaintances. Colleagues leaned close in animated greetings, but not one paused to look into his eyes. The air was thick with recognition for everyone but him. Their glances slid over his face, deliberately casual, as though acknowledging him would disrupt the polished image they wished to project. It was not absence of awareness, it was choice. They knew him. They knew his name, his history, his place. But their eyes carried the unspoken message, not here, not now, not you. He stood in that current of movement, feeling himself erased in real time. He saw the slight hesitation in their steps when they noticed him, followed by the conscious decision to turn their gaze elsewhere, to speak louder to the person beside them, to pretend they had not seen him at all. It was not simple neglect. It was rejection disguised as indifference. And it pierced sharper than open hostility. To be hated was at least to be acknowledged. To be ignored was to be buried alive. He caught the reflection of it in their expressions, how their faces softened when greeting others, how laughter bloomed easily in their eyes, how warmth was offered freely to those who had contributed far less than he had. And when their eyes brushed against him, even for a fraction of a second, there was a flicker of something colder, discomfort, irritation, the impatience of being forced to remember the man they had worked so hard to forget. In their rush to celebrate the present, they were willing to exile the very past that made it possible. Each dismissal was a knife twisted deeper. He thought of the hours spent building futures that were not his own, the sweat poured into work that allowed them to stand here today in fine clothes and bright light. He thought of promises once whispered in gratitude, vows of loyalty spoken in younger days, now broken without hesitation. He thought of sacrifices made in silence, sacrifices that no one clapped for, no one praised, but that had given them this life they now flaunted. And yet, here he was, reduced to an unwelcome shadow, unworthy even of a nod in passing. But what struck him most was not their coldness, it was his own composure. He did not chase their eyes, did not beg for their recognition. He let them pass, one after another, carrying their indifference like a cloak they believed would shield them. They did not realize that by refusing to see him, they revealed more about themselves than about him. Their dismissive glances were confessions, proof of their arrogance, proof of their ingratitude, proof that their pride was built not on truth, but on denial. And so he stood, a man apart, quiet, but unbroken. Each averted glance, each deliberate silence, each refusal to acknowledge him, was another stone laid on a growing weight of truth. For he knew, as surely as he had once known hunger and struggle, that truth does not vanish when ignored. It waits, and when it rises, it does so with a force far greater than false pride can withstand. He had almost grown used to the weight of their silence when a sharper wound cut through the air. It came not as a shout, not as an accusation, but as a whisper, soft enough to pass for carelessness, cruel enough to pierce through his skin. Why did he even come? He has nothing to do with this event. The words slid through the crowd like a serpent, meant for one ear, but caught by many. Whispers always carry farther than intended, and this one found its way back to him with devastating clarity. He did not turn his head to see who had spoken. It did not matter. The voice could have belonged to any of them. Niece, nephew, cousin, perhaps even a child repeating what they had overheard at home. The sting was not in the speaker, but in the truth revealed, that this was how they all thought. His presence, once the anchor of their gatherings, was now treated as an intrusion, an inconvenience, a relic dragged into a world that had outgrown him. The whisper reverberated inside his chest, louder than the music echoing from the stage, louder than the chatter that swirled around him. He felt it settle like lead in his bones. How quickly gratitude turns to contempt, how swiftly memories of sacrifice are buried under the arrogance of success. He had carried them through storms, shielded them from ruin, given pieces of himself so they could stand tall, and now they asked why he had come, as though he were an outsider trespassing in a house built by his own hands. What pained him most was not the insult itself, but the reaction it stirred in those around. Some heard it and looked away, pretending not to notice. Others exchanged faint smirks, as if amused by the cruelty. A few shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up, none countered, none defended him. Their silence became agreement, their passivity a second betrayal. He was not simply facing one voice. He was facing the quiet approval of an entire circle that no longer wished to claim him. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Anger threatened to rise, but he forced it down. Anger was what they expected. Proof that he did not belong, proof that he was bitter, proof that he was less than they were. But he would not give them that. He had not endured hunger, rejection, and decades of labor only to break now at a careless whisper. His silence became his shield, though inside it the wound bled freely. The whisper, however, had a power its speaker did not intend, for in its cruelty it revealed the truth to the room. Many had heard it, more than the careless voice realized, and those words, dripping with scorn, would linger in their minds. They might laugh now, they might dismiss him still, but the venom of that question, why did he even come, was not only an attack on him, it was a reflection of them, a mirror of their ingratitude, a testimony of their blindness. He straightened in his seat, lifting his chin ever so slightly. They thought to erase him with whispers, to push him further into the shadows. But he knew whispers cannot silence truth forever. One day soon his name would not be muttered behind hands, but spoken aloud before all. And when that day came, the shame of their words would echo far louder than their laughter ever had. The laughter rolled through the hall like a wave, loud and unrestrained, as if joy itself had chosen to live only in the voices of others. They clinked glasses, told stories, leaned into each other with warmth reserved for those they chose to see. To him, the sound was not light but heavy, each burst of laughter striking like a reminder that he was no longer counted among them. They laughed not because he was there, but as though he wasn't, as though his presence was nothing but empty space at the edge of the room. He stood still in the noise, watching familiar faces glow in the brilliance of recognition. These were the same faces that once had turned to him in moments of despair. He could remember clearly long nights when storms threatened their work, when debts pressed down like chains, when failure seemed certain. He had been the one awake while they slept, the one who held their fragile hopes together when they were ready to break. He had listened to their fears, answered their questions, carried their burdens without complaint. He had stood beside them in the darkest days, yet now, in the light of their success, they chose to forget. Every roar of amusement, every careless smile, felt like a rewriting of history. Their stories left him out, their memories edited to remove his hand, his sacrifice, his voice. It was as though he had never been there, as though the foundation of their triumphs had been laid by no one. In their laughter he heard not joy but betrayal, the betrayal of selective memory, of gratitude erased by pride. The cruelest part was the ease with which they forgot. They did not even pause, did not stumble over his absence in their stories. It was natural to them, effortless, to replace him with themselves, to build new narratives where he had no place. Their joy was a celebration not of truth but of denial. They laughed because they believed the past could be rewritten, because they believed he could be erased. He felt the ache press deeper into his chest, not because they had abandoned him, but because they had abandoned honesty itself. A man can endure being overlooked. What burns is being erased from the very history he built. He remained quiet, his eyes steady, his back straight, carrying himself with the dignity that silence affords. For while they laughed in blindness, he knew what they did not. Laughter built on lies is fragile. It cracks when truth arrives. He did not need to remind them of the nights he had sacrificed, the days he had fought for them, the years he had spent shaping the ground they walked upon. Time would remind them. Truth would remind them. And when the laughter finally faltered, and it always does, they would remember the man who had stood beside them when joy was absent, when only struggle remained. They would remember too late, but they would remember. For now, he bore their laughter like he had once borne their weakness, not as something that could break him, but as something he would outlast. And deep inside, beneath the wound, he carried a certainty sharper than their joy. They could laugh without him, but they could not erase him. Not forever. He moved quietly through the sea of bodies, slipping unnoticed between groups of relatives and colleagues who did not pause, did not part, did not see him. The chairs near the front were filled with eager faces, leaning toward the stage, their eyes hungry for recognition, their voices bright with laughter. He did not belong among them, and so he drifted further back, until at last he found a chair in the corner, half in shadow, far from the glow of the lights. He sat, alone, surrounded by noise but untouched by it. a solitary figure drowned in a crowd that had already decided he was no longer part of their story. From where he sat, he could see everything, the way heads tilted toward one another in conspiratorial whispers, the way glasses clinked as if sealing new bonds, the way pride inflated chests at the sound of certain names. They were all performing, all radiant in the glow of recognition. But here, at the edge, he was invisible. Not one turned to him, not one sought his gaze, not one remembered that there had been a time when the center of the room could not have existed without him. His heart grew heavy, but his eyes betrayed none of it. He did not lower his head, did not let his shoulders collapse under the weight of their indifference. His face remained calm, his expression composed, though inside he felt the cold of exile. He was in the room, but not of it, like a ghost haunting the very house he had built. The laughter rolled toward him in waves, but it broke against the wall of his silence. Memories surfaced, unbidden, pressing against his chest like stones. He remembered when gatherings like this had been different, when his presence had been sought after, when his counsel had been valued, when his name carried warmth instead of dismissal. He remembered late nights spent drafting plans, early mornings laboring so that these very people could stand here in fine clothes, speaking of successes built on foundations he had laid. Now they sat in the light, while he sat in the corner, as though none of it had ever belonged to him. But even in his isolation there was a strange strength. From his seat in the shadows he could see them clearly in a way they could not see themselves. He saw the desperation behind their smiles, the insecurity hidden beneath their boasts, the hollowness in their laughter. He realized then that his solitude was not emptiness but clarity. They needed the crowd to feel whole. He did not. He had stood alone before, in days much darker than this, and endured. The weight in his chest pressed hard, but it did not bend him. Let them laugh. Let them turn their backs. Let them pretend he was a stranger. He knew what they had forgotten, that isolation is not defeat, that silence is not erasure. He sat apart from them now, quiet and unyielding, waiting. For though they had cast him into the shadows, he knew there would come a moment when the light, unasked and undeniable, would find him first. From his chair in the shadows, the noise of the hall seemed to drift away, replaced by the sharper sound of memory. It came in fragments, piercing and relentless, as though his own mind refused to let him sit in silence without reminding him of the path that had brought him here. He saw again the long nights of his youth, when the rest of the family slept while he stayed awake, shoulders bent over ledgers by the dim glow of a single lamp. He remembered the taste of fatigue so bitter it felt like metal in his mouth, the sting of frost in his bones as he left home before dawn, the ache in his hands after labor that refused to end. He had given them everything. Each sacrifice had been a brick laid quietly into the foundation of their comfort. When they were too young to understand the weight of debt, he bore it on his back. When failure knocked on their door, it was he who stood between them and ruin. When they wept with fear of what tomorrow might bring, he offered them his strength, though his own heart trembled in secret. He gave up not just years, but pieces of himself, dreams he could have followed, comforts he could have kept, rest he could have taken, so they would have the chance to rise. The images flooded him with painful clarity. He saw his younger self lifting boxes until his muscles burned, the skin on his palms split open but refusing to stop because the work had to be done. He saw the day he sold something dear to him, a gift from his own father, so that his son could afford the education that would later become the cornerstone of his pride. He remembered skipping meals so others could eat, staying silent about his struggles so they could carry their own heads high. His entire life had been a long surrender of self in exchange for their future. And now, here in this hall, not one remembered. His sacrifices had been scrubbed from their story, as though they had never existed. They basked in the glow of their achievements, without recalling who had lit the first fire, who had kept it alive when the wind howled hardest. Their laughter mocked not only him, but the very truth of history. To them, his suffering was not just forgotten, it was erased. The weight of that realization pressed heavily against him. He did not crave praise, never had. But to see his sacrifices so easily discarded, to realize they no longer even whispered of what he had done, it cut deeper than exhaustion ever had. Betrayal, he understood now, was not always in harsh words or cruel actions. Sometimes it lived in silence, in the way people choose to forget the very hands that lifted them. Yet, even in the pain of these memories, there was a thread of steel. He knew what they did not. Sacrifices do not vanish simply because others choose to erase them. They live on in the strength they created, in the successes they enabled, in the very existence of the people who now dismissed him. His name may have been pushed into shadows, but his work was written into their lives, unerasable. He sat still, his eyes steady, his heart heavy, but unbroken. Let them laugh. Let them forget. The truth of his sacrifices could not be silenced. And though they had wiped him from their stories, life itself had kept the record. Somewhere in the unfolding of this night, he knew, that record would speak. And when it did, no one in this room would escape the weight of remembering what they had chosen to forget. The lights shifted, and the hum of conversation fell into a hush as the master of ceremonies called the first name. From the crowd his son rose, straight-backed, polished in his tailored suit, the glint of triumph already fixed in his eyes. He walked toward the stage with the slow, deliberate steps of a man convinced the evening belonged to him. The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of sound that seemed to lift him higher, carrying him into the glow of the spotlights. From his corner, the father watched, his face calm though his chest tightened with 1,000 unspoken memories. He remembered when this same boy once clutched his hand, trembling before a school recital, whispering, "What if I forget my lines?" He had bent low then, telling him courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand despite it. That boy had grown, and now he stood tall on a stage, the applause thundering as though he had never needed anyone to steady him. The sun's smile widened beneath the lights, soaking in the admiration. He nodded confidently, gestured toward the audience, even paused for effect as though the moment were crafted by his own will. Pride radiated from him like fire, pride so blinding it left no room for humility. To him, this was the culmination of his own brilliance, the proof that his name, his presence, his voice mattered above all others. And the crowd, eager to celebrate, gave him what he craved. Yet in the shadows, the father saw more than the glitter of triumph. He saw the hollowness beneath the pride. Every word the son spoke, every principle he credited to his own journey, carried the faint echo of lessons once whispered at a kitchen table, long before the lights, long before the suits, long before applause had taught him arrogance. The foundations of his confidence had been borrowed, the tools of his success handed to him. Yet now he stood as if he had forged them from nothing. The father's heart ached, not for himself, but for the blindness of it all. His son believed the stage was his alone, that the light was proof of independence, not inheritance. He believed his name was the center of tonight's story, forgetting that no man builds alone, forgetting the invisible hands that had steadied him when he faltered. The applause grew louder, filling the hall until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, exalting the one who now stood in glory. And in that sound, the father felt the full weight of his isolation. Not one hand clapped for him, though the man on stage carried his voice, his lessons, his sacrifices hidden beneath his smile. The crowd celebrated, but they celebrated a reflection, blind to the source. Still, he did not look away. He sat with quiet dignity, his eyes steady, his expression unbroken. Let his son bask in the light. Let the pride swell higher and higher. For the Father knew what the others could not see, that pride built on denial is fragile, and light has a way of exposing what arrogance tries to hide. Tonight, his son believed his name was the first and greatest, but the Father, waiting in silence, carried the certainty that the true first name had not yet been spoken. On stage, the son's voice grew stronger, carried by the microphone and echoed through the great hall as though every word were carved from his own brilliance. He spoke with confidence, pausing in just the right places, smiling with the ease of a man who believed the crowd belonged to him. Applause punctuated his sentences, affirmations came from eager faces, and with each response he stood taller, more convinced of his own greatness. Yet for the man sitting in the corner, every phrase struck like a knife, sharp not because they were unfamiliar, but because they were his. The father listened, his heart heavy, as the son repeated the lessons he had once whispered to him in the silence of their kitchen, in the sweat of their labor, in the nights when there was nothing but struggle and the promise of perseverance. He heard the line about patience outlasting haste, the reminder that trust is worth more than profit, the belief that a man's word is stronger than any contract. He had said those things long before this stage, long before the suit, long before anyone cared to applaud. They had not been crafted for spectacle, but carved out of sacrifice and hardship. And now here they were, polished and repackaged, presented as if born from his son's own wisdom. The son smiled as the crowd nodded, pleased with his eloquence. He lifted his hand, gesturing broadly, and spoke of the courage it takes to rise from nothing, of the importance of standing firm when storms come. The father closed his eyes for a moment, because he remembered the exact night those words had first been spoken by him to his son, when the boy was broken by failure and ready to give up. He had placed his arm around the boy's shoulders and told him that storms do not last, but the man who endures them becomes unshakable. It had been a father's gift, given in love, in the quiet darkness of a home that shook with uncertainty. And now, his son offered it to strangers, wearing it like a crown, while the giver sat unnoticed in the shadows. What cut deeper than the theft was the silence around it. Not one person in the hall knew where those words had come from. Not one turned their head to acknowledge the man who had given them life. To the crowd, it was the son's genius, his voice, his wisdom. The father sat invisible, erased, watching his own legacy dressed in another man's pride. It was not just a wound, it was a burial. But still, he did not move, did not speak. His eyes remained steady, his face calm. Inside, sorrow mingled with something stronger, a strange certainty, unbreakable. He knew that truth, though hidden, is not destroyed. A seed planted in darkness still grows, and when it finally breaks the surface, no one can deny its roots. His son's boast was loud, it filled the hall, but it was borrowed light. And borrowed light always flickers when the true source begins to shine. The applause thundered again, hollow in the father's ears. His son bowed slightly, basking in recognition. Yet as the father watched, his calm deepened. Pride can mimic wisdom, but it cannot own it. And though the crowd may not yet see it, though his son might cling to it, the father knew the truth. Every word spoken on that stage belonged to him long before it was stolen. And soon the silence of the forgotten would give way to the undeniable voice of remembrance. The applause for the son's final words still echoed when the lights dimmed slightly and a hush rippled across the hall. The stage, which only moments before had belonged to the pride of others, shifted its gravity toward a single figure emerging from the side. The speaker entered slowly, not rushing, for he needed no performance to command respect. His presence alone silenced the laughter, hushed the whispers, drew every restless glance to the front. A man of dignity, trusted and revered, he carried with him not just authority but truth, the kind of truth that cannot be bought, borrowed, or faked. The father watched from the shadows as the atmosphere transformed. The same crowd that had moments earlier drowned in its own arrogance now straightened in their seats, their faces alert, their pride trembling just slightly under the weight of anticipation. They knew what was coming. The names. The list that would define honor for the night. The roll call of those whose contributions could not be ignored. It was the moment everyone had waited for, the climax of their ambition, the stage where legacies were either confirmed or forgotten. A subtle tension hung in the air, and the father felt it settle into his bones. He had no expectation of hearing his name. The evening had already shown him where he stood in their eyes, erased, dismissed, unworthy even of acknowledgement. Yet as the silence deepened, he could not deny that some part of him still ached, still longed, not for applause, not for recognition, but for justice. Not justice shouted from rooftops, but justice whispered in the hearts of those who had forgotten him. Justice that would make them face the truth they tried so hard to bury. The speaker approached the podium, adjusting his notes with deliberate calm. He scanned the hall once, his gaze steady, measured. No one moved. Even the sun, who had minutes ago glowed with confidence, now sat tense, his hands folded too tightly in his lap, his chest rising with anxious breaths. He believed this was still his night, that the first name would be his, that the room would stand again for him. He clung to that belief like a drowning man clings to a raft. The father observed it all, the shallow smiles, the quickened breaths, the hungry eyes fixed on the speaker. He saw their pride trembling under the surface, desperate for validation. And in that moment, he understood something profound. It was not only his son who had built his identity on borrowed ground. The entire crowd, in its eagerness to erase him, had built its narrative on denial. They had written a story without him in it, a story that could only survive so long as truth remained silent. But truth was about to be spoken. It was there in the weight of the speaker's notes, in the way his voice would soon break the silence. The father felt his heart beat steady, not quick, not frantic, but calm, anchored in something the others did not yet see. This was the moment where light and shadow would trade places, where erasure would be undone not by his voice, but by one who carried authority. The hall held its breath. Every face turned toward the podium. Every ambition, every ounce of arrogance, every denial balanced on the edge of the speaker's lips. And the father, sitting quietly in the corner, knew with unshakable certainty that when the first name was spoken, the silence of his exile would finally begin to crack. The speaker adjusted the microphone, his presence commanding even without words, and the hall fell into a silence so deep it seemed almost unnatural. Chairs creaked as bodies leaned forward, breaths slowed, anticipation wound itself tighter with each passing second. The son's chest swelled as though he could already hear his name echoing first, certain the world would affirm what he believed was his right. Around him, relatives and colleagues straightened in their seats, their eyes bright with expectation, waiting for the familiar names they assumed deserved the highest places. The father sat unmoving in the corner, unseen by most, watching this collective hunger unfold. He could feel the tension stretching like a wire, could sense the pride vibrating in the room, each face painted with the confidence of those who were sure the spotlight belonged only to them. No one glanced toward him, not even for a moment. In their minds, his name had been erased long ago, buried beneath newer stories, fresher victories, shinier reputations. To them, he was invisible, a ghost sitting in the crowd, harmless and irrelevant. And yet, as he watched, he felt something stir beneath the weight of that silence. The speaker's voice had not yet broken it, but already the air trembled with the gravity of what was about to come. The father knew how they thought, how they believed only certain names could possibly be remembered, let alone honored. But he also knew the truth. Real legacies do not vanish simply because others refuse to see them. They live quietly in the marrow of time, waiting for the moment to surface. The silence grew unbearable, pressing down on the hall. A cough in the distance was quickly swallowed. Shoes shifted nervously against the polished floor, but still the speaker held back, drawing them deeper into suspense. The son's smile twitched at the corners, too rehearsed, too eager, as though he feared the pause itself might stretch into doubt. The father noticed it, the small betrayals in his son's composure, the way his hand gripped the table too tightly, the way his eyes refused to leave the podium. Pride, when tested by silence, begins to show its cracks. In that moment, the father realized the power of silence. It was heavier than any speech, sharper than accusation, stronger than fury. The silence reminded him of his own life, of nights when there were no words, only the quiet of endless work, of sacrifices made unseen, unpraised, unacknowledged. Silence had always been his companion, but never his defeat. And now, as the entire hall bent under its weight, he sensed that silence was about to become his vindication. They were waiting for their names, their recognition, their moment of triumph. None of them expected his. None of them believed his name still lived in memory, still carried weight beyond the shadows they had pushed him into. But the father, sitting in calm stillness, felt the truth pressing close. The pause before the storm, the breath before the revelation. The silence in that hall was not emptiness. It was a fuse, burning unseen, drawing closer to the moment when everything they thought secure would be shaken. And when the first name left the speaker's lips, the illusion that he had been erased would shatter forever. The speaker finally drew in a breath, lifted his eyes from the page, and let his voice cut through the suffocating stillness of the hall. And then, with a weight that seemed to shake the air itself, he spoke the first name. Not the sons, not the nephews, not the polished faces that sat ready to stand. No, the name that fell from his lips was the one no one had dared to expect, the one they had ignored, dismissed, buried in silence. It was his name, spoken clearly, deliberately, with respect so sharp it sliced through the arrogance that had ruled the room only moments before. For a second, there was no reaction. The crowd sat stunned, the weight of disbelief pinning them in place. Their minds scrambled to catch up, to make sense of what they had heard. How could it be him? The man in the corner, the one they had not greeted, not acknowledged, not even included in their glances. His name was the first on the list. Not hidden in the middle, not thrown in as an afterthought, but at the top, where only honor and authority belonged. The father did not move. His back remained straight, his eyes calm, his face unreadable, but inside, his heart beat with a quiet force, not of pride, not of vengeance, but of vindication. Years of sacrifice, erased by those he loved, were suddenly restored in a single breath. Decades of being diminished, overlooked, forgotten, all undone by the truth spoken from a voice that could not be denied. Around him, the silence cracked. Heads turned sharply, eyes widened, jaws stiffened. The very people who had brushed past him moments before now stared at him as though seeing him for the first time. Relatives who had whispered about his irrelevance, colleagues who had laughed without him, children who had chosen not to notice him, all of them sat frozen in the revelation that the man they had erased was not only remembered but honored above them all. The son's smile faltered, then collapsed. His hand, gripping the edge of the table, shook visibly. He had believed the evening belonged to him, that his name would be the first to thunder across the hall. But it had not been his. It had been his father's. And in that moment, the stage he stood on crumbled beneath his feet. His pride, inflated for so long, deflated into shame, so heavy he could barely lift his head. The father did not gloat, did not rise to demand applause. He simply remained as he was, steady in his seat, a man who had no need to chase what was already his. The respect carried in that single announcement was more powerful than any defense he could have offered, more enduring than any argument. His name, spoken aloud, had silenced every whisper, every dismissal, every cruel glance. And in that hall, filled with the echoes of his name, the truth became undeniable. The man they had refused to see was the very man who stood above them all. A ripple moved through the hall the instant his name was spoken, as though the sound itself had struck each listener across the face. Chairs creaked, necks twisted, and all at once the crowd turned toward the corner where he sat. The same people who, only moments before, had brushed past him without a word, who had pretended not to see him, now stared as though he had risen from the dead. Their eyes betrayed them, astonishment, disbelief, and behind it all, a dawning shame they could not hide. Faces, once bright with laughter, were pale now, stiff with unease. The grandchildren who had whispered among themselves lowered their eyes, as if realizing too late that they had mocked the very man whose name commanded the stage. The relatives who had looked straight through him just hours earlier now shifted in their seats, caught between the instinct to applaud and the dread of being exposed in their ingratitude. Even the colleagues, polished and proud in their suits, struggled to mask their surprise. Their admiration, once freely given to his son, had been snatched away in an instant and redirected toward the man they had tried to erase. He did not move. He did not wave to acknowledge them, did not bask in their sudden recognition. His composure was unbroken, his hands still folded in his lap, his eyes calm as stone. But in that very stillness, he became larger than the stage, larger than the list, larger than the pride of all those who had sought to bury him. They could not look away, because dignity does not need to shout. It commands by its presence alone. The son sat frozen on the stage, his skin damp, his breath shallow. He felt the eyes of the crowd slipping from him, drawn irresistibly to the man he had silenced for so long. It was no longer his moment, no longer his glory. It was his father's, and not because of a performance, not because of boasts, but because the truth had spoken, undeniable and final. The son's mask cracked in front of them all, and the shame of years poured into the silence between father and child. And the father, seated in the corner, bore it all without a word. He did not gloat, did not demand they bow to him, did not need the applause that had once been denied. The crowd's turning heads were enough. In their eyes, filled with regret, with confusion, with the sudden weight of conscience, he saw what he had known all along. Truth waits. It may be silenced for a season, hidden beneath arrogance and denial, but when it rises, it forces the world to turn and see. That night, the hall became a mirror. In their astonishment, in their shame, in their restless shifting, they revealed themselves. They had forgotten him, but he had never been forgotten. They had erased him, but his name had been carved deeper than memory. And now, as they looked at him with the heavy eyes of the guilty, he sat, unshaken, carrying the strength of every sacrifice, every scar, every silent endurance that had finally spoken louder than their pride. On the stage, under the lights that had moments earlier crowned him with false glory, the son felt the ground give way beneath his feet. His breath caught in his throat, his chest tightened, and the confident posture he had practiced so carefully faltered. The applause that once seemed certain was gone, replaced by silence that pressed down like a mountain. He looked out over the crowd and saw their faces, not filled with admiration for him, but turned toward the man he had tried so hard to bury in shadows. The blood drained from his face. His smile, once broad and unshakable, trembled at the edges before collapsing entirely. He clutched the edge of the podium with white-knuckled hands, as though the wood itself could steady him against the weight of truth. Every word he had spoken earlier echoed back to him, hollow and counterfeit. He had paraded lessons that were never his, told stories that were not born of his own scars, and claimed wisdom he had only borrowed. And now, with his father's name spoken first, louder than all his boasts, the deception unraveled in front of every eye in the room. It was not anger that undid him. It was silence. No one needed to accuse him. No one needed to shout his betrayal aloud. The truth had spoken with a clarity sharper than any rebuke, and it was enough. His own children, seated near the front, shifted uncomfortably, their small faces puzzled by the shame that clung to their father. His wife lowered her eyes, unwilling to meet the gaze of the man who had raised the husband she now saw diminished. Even distant relatives, who had once cheered him as the family's pride, stared with unease, realizing that their applause had been misplaced. The son tried to speak, to reclaim the air slipping away from him, but his voice betrayed him. It cracked, unsteady, thin. Words of thanks, of pride, of self-importance stuck in his throat, choked by the weight of what had been revealed. He coughed, stumbled, reached for a thread of composure, but none would come. His arrogance had been built on a fragile scaffolding, and with one spoken name it had all collapsed. The father watched from his corner, unmoving. He did not rise, did not speak, did not smirk with satisfaction. His silence was enough, heavier than judgment, deeper than scorn. The son's collapse was not orchestrated by revenge, but by truth itself. Truth had waited patiently, quietly, and now it stripped away every mask, leaving the son small beneath the glare of the lights. And as the hall sat in that stillness, all who had mocked, dismissed, or ignored the old man could see plainly what pride had hidden. The son's strength had never been his own. His brilliance had been borrowed. His throne, built on denial, was crumbling beneath him. And now, exposed before the very people he had sought to impress, he stood no longer as the heir of greatness, but as the shadow of a man whose legacy could not be erased. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the father rose from his chair in the shadows. The movement was unhurried, unforced, carrying no weight of anger, no hunger for vengeance. He simply stood, and in that simple act the hall shifted. The murmurs that had begun to stir fell silent again, as though the very air recognized the gravity of his presence. He did not need to demand their attention. It was already his. All eyes followed him, the same eyes that only an hour before had slid past him as if he were invisible. Now there was no avoiding him. Their glances, heavy with shame and awe, clung to him with a helplessness they could not conceal. Even the son, pale and trembling beneath the lights, lowered his gaze, unable to meet the calm authority of the man he had dismissed. The father's steps were steady as he moved toward the aisle. He did not rush, did not stumble. Each stride carried the quiet dignity of a man who had walked through storms greater than this, who had carried burdens heavier than the scorn of a forgetful family. He did not need to speak, because his silence was already a voice, louder than any defense, sharper than any accusation. No reproach left his lips. He did not recount the nights he had labored for them, did not list the sacrifices carved into his bones, did not remind them of the debts they owed to his name. To do so would have cheapened the truth. They already knew. The shame on their faces told him they knew. Words were unnecessary. His stillness, his composure, his refusal to rage, that was the verdict. And it was devastating. Because fury could be resisted, argued against, dismissed as bitterness. But dignity? Dignity left no room for escape. Dignity forced them to confront themselves, to hear their own whispers echo in their conscience, to feel the weight of every dismissive glance, every cold silence, every betrayal. His calm stripped them bare, holding up a mirror that no one wanted to face. The son's collapse deepened as his father's quiet figure stood taller than the stage itself. He had prepared speeches, polished words, practiced pride. But against his father's silence, all of it turned to dust. The applause he had once craved now felt hollow, the recognition meaningless, because the man he had cast aside stood in front of them all, not angry, not triumphant, but unbroken. The crowd shifted uneasily, their guilt thick in the air, and yet the father's composure remained unshaken. This was not a moment of revenge, not a reclaiming of pride through fury. It was justice fulfilled in the purest form, not by force, but by truth, and truth, when carried with dignity, has a weight no one can resist. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes calm, his face serene. He had no need to speak, for the silence said it all. I am still here. I always was. You tried to erase me, but my name endures. My legacy remains. My dignity stands unshaken. And in that silence, the hall understood something they would never forget. Fury burns fast and fades. But dignity outlives shame, outlasts betrayal, and echoes louder than any voice raised in anger ever could. From that day forward, his name could no longer be hidden in shadows. It lingered in every corner of the hall, in the silence that had once dismissed him, in the eyes that now followed him with awe and regret. The same mouths that had whispered against him now dared not speak without recalling the sound of his name spoken first, spoken with respect, spoken with a weight no one could challenge. It was no longer a name passed over lightly. It had become a symbol, a reminder that truth does not vanish when ignored, that sacrifice is not erased by pride, that dignity endures even when love turns to betrayal. The family who had once looked through him now carried the burden of memory. At gatherings, his absence was heavier than his presence had ever been. They could no longer laugh without recalling the night when the laughter died at the sound of his name. They could not boast without remembering that their pride had been built on lessons they did not create. His son, who had stood so confidently beneath the lights, now walked in the long shadow of his father's dignity. Every handshake, every business deal, every word of wisdom he offered carried the echo of another voice, the one he had tried so hard to silence. And though the world might still applaud him, he knew in his heart that he would never stand taller than the man who had been named first. Even the grandchildren, too young to fully grasp the weight of that evening, grew up with the story on their lips. They repeated it in hushed tones, how their grandfather's name had been honored above all others, how the hall itself had turned to him in reverence, and though they once giggled at his silence, they now saw in it the strength of mountains, the stillness of a man who had carried generations on his shoulders. His name became a lesson for them, one not of wealth or show, but of endurance, sacrifice, and unshakable truth. Beyond the family, the world outside carried his name too. The clients, colleagues, and strangers who had heard it spoken that night passed it along with respect, with gratitude, with recognition of the man whose teachings had shaped them. His wisdom, once buried in silence, spread farther than he ever imagined, reaching places his feet would never walk, shaping lives he would never meet. His name traveled beyond walls, beyond cities, beyond time itself. It became a mark of integrity, whispered not in dismissal, but in reverence, a touchstone for those who sought to understand what it meant to stand with dignity when the world turns its back. And he himself? He did not change. He remained the same man who had once worked through nights, given without asking, carried without complaint. He did not chase the newfound reverence, did not demand apologies from those who had scorned him. He carried the recognition as he had carried the silence before it, with composure, with humility, with an understanding that legacy is not about applause, but about endurance. He did not need to shout his triumph, because the truth had spoken for him. The crowd had learned its lesson, though at a cost. They realized that to deny him was to deny the very ground beneath their feet. To reject him was to reject the truth of their own history. They understood, too late, that their betrayal had never diminished him. It had only diminished them. For his legacy was not in their hands. It was larger, deeper, beyond their control. And so his name became eternal, louder than betrayal, deeper than pain, stronger than silence. It outlived their mockery, outlasted their laughter, and became something they could never take away, a symbol of justice without fury, of truth without vanity, of dignity that endured long after the voices of scorn had gone quiet. His name, spoken first on the list, remained first in memory, unerasable. And though they had once tried to bury him in the crowd, history itself had lifted him higher, ensuring that his legacy would never again be forgotten.